Hello, Dr. Murdock. I'm curious, with the slides that we're looking at growth of income in the future, did that slide take into account any assumptions for automation displacing jobs?
No, it assumes about the only thing you can do is it assumes constancy in those kind of factors. In this case, it's moved only by the demographics, which obviously is only one factor, so it's not all.
Yes, sir. I'm Representative Biederman. Excuse me. I'm Representative Biederman. So I'm married to an Hispanic.
Yep.
What are my kids?
Well, whatever you want them to be.
Are they non-Hispanic whites, or are they Hispanic, or who are they?
Well,
according to your statistics,
well,
just trying to get an idea of.
It's what they declare themselves to be. In the census, nobody comes around and checks you what your race or ethnic group is. You can say you're both in some things, but in the census form, you would probably say that you were non-Hispanic white and Hispanic, because there's two questions. There's a question on race and a question on ethnicity.
Well, I'm just wondering, because as more Hispanics come into Texas, of course, the whites and Hispanics will be marrying, and so that's going to affect the numbers to find out
and
what you're using for numbers.
Well, in our analysis, so we've looked at that. We've looked at intermarriage. It's not in these data, but we've looked at the basically intermarriage issues, and so we should get a more mixing of racial and ethnic groups, but it is not as frequent as people often think. In other words, marriage between racial and ethnic groups is not. Yes, it occurs. Yes, it's more than it used to be, but it's general. It's not at the level that some people think it is. In other words, it's not 1 out of every 2. It's not 1 out of every 3. It's more like 1 out of 5 or 6 or 7, as a population as a whole.
Thank you, Dr. Murdock. My name is Victoria Niave. I represent House District 107, which covers parts of East Dallas, Garland, and Mesquite. And this information was really compelling, and I want to thank you for that. I wanted to ask you about the slide and the information on the unauthorized immigrants coming through. And from your analysis, we hear that there's allegedly like a big influx, but then we also hear that there have been lots of immigrants that have left. So has there been a net increase, decrease, or is it net zero?
Well, the data that we have, our data is a couple of years old in this, but the number of undocumented persons, if you're talking about undocumented, has tended to increase. Now, what's going to happen right now with what we're doing politically, I don't know. There's a lot of trade-offs here, which I think is really important for people to understand. Because if we don't get more people with younger population structures, we're going to be older and less competitive in the future than we are today. Because people that look like me, we are not reproducing ourselves in terms of numbers. And as a result of that, if you look at the future, and this, by the way, this isn't just Texas. This is the country. The future of Texas and the future of country of the United States is tied to its minority populations, and how well they do is going to be how well the U.S. and Texas does. Now, that's not a political statement. That's simply looking at the numbers and saying if we don't change the socioeconomics that go with the demographics, we will be less competitive. Because education has been the key, and we've got these educational disparities. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Sure, Representative Springer. I'm the rural guy, so when you're talking about that, and so a couple of my questions revolve around that. While we looked at the major urban counties, how many counties in Texas are growing out of the 254 population?
Oh, goodness.
Is it above half?
Yeah. Boy, you got me off.
Then my next one is which ones are above the state average?
Oh, well, there's lots. The ones that, let me put it this way. The ones that are struggling are rural counties, distant from large metropolitan centers. The counties that are growing the fastest are suburban counties. in and around all of our large major cities. And then metropolitan centers depends upon which one you're talking about.
Right. Well, I have, so 22 counties I represent, 21 of them have declined in population over from where I can.
Are you in East Texas?
North Texas. I'm
Northeast?
Northwest Texas.
Northwest,
so,
okay, yeah.
North of Denton towards Lubbock and up in Amarillo.
Yeah. You're part of the Great Plains.
Yes.
And I'm originally from North Dakota, which is part of the Great Plains. And one of my professors used to say, all other things being the same, the Great Plains loses population. And that's been true now for a long period of time.
Well, as we've yet to replace the agricultural commodity.
That's exactly what it is.
Technology has come along. We need fewer and fewer
Absolutely.
hands on the farm to be able to do that. Yeah. I had one question when we were looking at the sort of the income deal, and I don't know if y'all looked at it from this standpoint, but if you pull the top 1% of wage earners out of each category, then how do the races then start looking at each other? Because I've heard numbers that have been skewed by that sort of, the Michael Dells of the world may skew that number compared to the rest.
Yeah,
and that may be a small amount of skewing, and it may be a massive amount of skewing.
Well, it's going to be a very small amount of the Michael Dells of the world. It would be nice to be a Michael Dell of the world. I'll never know what that would be like. But anyway, in terms of the numbers, they're not going to be markedly skewed by that.
Thank you.
You've been making these presentations for 20 years, and I've seen them for 20 years, having been built since 1997.
Mm-hmm.
Have we made any progress?
I think we've made progress in terms of educational aspects, or we have not closed the gaps. To use a saying that the thing that was used by the Higher Education Coordinating Board at one time. We certainly have a larger number of people in disadvantaged groups that are doing better than was true a lot longer ago, but overall, our progress has been moderate, is the way I would put it.
Dr. Murdock,
I'm sorry.
Representative Uresti, two-part question. In regards to the public education in the minority group, have you noticed when we started using the STAR tax test as it's changed over the years, that has had an impact on the increase or decrease on the graduation rate or the up to college level?
We haven't really, my group has not looked at that, no. Probably we should, but we have not looked at that particular item.
And then the other part would be whether you've seen an increase on charter school versus public schools on increasing of the education also.
Again, I'm not, we're not experts on those two items. Sorry.
Right, thank you.
And then I'll get, you first.
Thank you, Dr. Murdock. My name is Sean Theory. I'm representative from District 146 in Houston. One of the slides I found, well, a couple of them I found really interesting, were that for the African American group, even when education was higher, they were still the lowest paid group out of all the professions. Mm-hmm. Even with a degree or even with the advanced degree, out of all of the groups, still last in terms of pay. Has that information ever been extracted from you to be presented to any other groups, such as corporations or any other agencies?
Oh, yeah. I don't do quite that many now. I used to do about 50 presentations a year. The best year or the worst year, I think I did 120. That has been there. It continues to be there. There is a difference that doesn't go away, and you can attribute that to a lot of things. You can attribute it to discrimination. You can just look at other factors as well. But the difference between African Americans and others continues to be there. Now, it pretty well continues to be there also for Hispanics. But the interesting thing is that that areas where Hispanics are more dominant, and of course, this is important because there are fewer areas for which, in the state, for which African Americans are dominant in terms of individual areas. But in those areas where Hispanics are dominant, we're seeing change. You know, the one I always say is, you know, as I used it earlier today, is if you look at Hispanics and you look at assimilation, and that's a bad word to some people, and I don't want to make, it's just a word, okay, in the sense, what you see is that well, I mean, I take San Antonio as my example. I lived in San Antonio, and you know, we had more kids. We started a program, in fact, a PhD program at UTSA, and what we did was we said, we're not just going to admit kids on the basis of GREs, because GREs are really good in differentiating people who've had lots of educational opportunities and not so many, okay? So if you start looking at it in terms of other dimensions, you begin to see that Hispanics increase in terms of their opportunities in the same educational categories. African Americans do too, but they do not increase the same level. Now, do I have all the explanations for that? I do not. Some people say it's discrimination. Okay, and there's some indication of that. I mean, this is something I hesitate to say, but you see it in all the data, and that data is that in the United States, skin color makes a difference, and you can see that in almost every racial and ethnic group where they have the differences. You know, there's been lots of studies done, for example, on African Americans. And what it shows is that African Americans that are lighter complected, etc., do better at controlling for education than those who are not. The same thing is true for Hispanics. And there's a set of literature on that. I'm not an expert on that. But it is a factor, and I'm not the psychologist or other person to tell you the reason for that, but it is there. Yes, sir. Oh.
We have to get the mic or else.
Oh, yeah, sure, I understand. I'm sorry.
How is the dependent population changing in Texas?
How is the what?
The dependent population, the
older population,
and younger.
Okay. Well, the older we're no different than the rest of the country. Our older population is increasing, okay? It is increasing most rapidly in terms of proportions for the non-Hispanic white population, because our fertility has been below replacement now for 25 to 30 years, depending on how you look at it. We're not reproducing ourselves. That's true in the country. It's true in Texas. And so, you know, that continues to age us, okay? Because if you're not having kids, you know, your age structure goes up, okay? And if you look at other groups, it's true for African Americans. In fact, the only group in the United States and Texas that is growing in terms of all different age categories is the Hispanic population. Non-Hispanic whites, you know, we are, you know, excuse me. The reality of it is that our proportions are decreasing. We are going to be less and less of the U.S. population and less of the Texas population, unless, you know, we all decide to change our birth numbers, okay? And this is not a social economic comment. This is simply a raw demographics comment.
So for the Asian group, why are they having higher levels of attainment than versus other minority groups? Do you have any kind of data on that? Or?
Well, two reasons. One is that, you know, I think everybody knows they have a very high emphasis on educational attainment. Also, the Asian population that we had, that we have gotten over time, has been a pretty well-educated population. In other words, a lot of our Asian population growth comes from young people who come to the United States to go to college and then stay, okay? So that if you're coming, you know, in other words, if you're adding lots of, or relatively lots in terms of proportions of college graduates, you're going to be doing better. And then coming to the United States is a very highly valued thing in terms of education.
So I know Texas is a pretty large Asian population, I guess, relative to the rest of the United States. What is that going to look like going forward? Is it going to increase? Or?
Oh yeah, it's going to increase, no doubt about it. You know, we're not as large as California, for example, which is the largest Asian population, or several others, but we have a fairly large, and I expect that'll increase. Yeah. Somebody back there?
I believe in the last 2 years that studies have shown that at this point more women than men are now attaining college degrees.
Absolutely.
And in particular among the younger group, 25 to 35-year-olds.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Women have 37%, I believe, of college degrees, or and then men 29% of men have college degrees. Is that, now that's sort of, I believe, nationwide. Mm-hmm. Among these groups, is that percentage, that split occurring at the same level or different levels?
For whom?
For among the other, is this?
Oh yeah, no. The as my wife likes to remind me, since she's a college professor as well, she would say, finally we women are getting our proper place. Now I don't think all of us men would agree with that, but it's true. Women are becoming dominant, not only in, you know, if you went 40, 50 years ago, about the only thing that women were dominant in terms of occupations was elementary education, okay? That's no longer true. In fact, if you go to places like medical school and law school, lots of them across the country have more women than men. And so that's a significant pattern, and it's occurring now in just increasingly across areas.
Is it great? Is that gap getting larger in different ethnic and racial groups? Is it wider in some groups than in others?
Is it probably? I don't have those statistics in my. I can look those up for you, but I don't have them right with me.
Dr. Murdock.
Yeah.
Miguel Guajardo. I too have been following your numbers since back 1995 when you introduced the Texas Challenge. And so my question is one of historical but also theoretical here, that the numbers you propose here, if they're going to remain constant or increase, all of this is based on a human capital theory, yeah, which simply interpreted is the more we invest, the better off a society will be, or a person will obtain. Considering the historical context that we're still trying to figure out, you know, Rodriguez versus San Antonio, Edgewood versus Kirby, on how we finance an equitable educational system for children. Outside of the correctional system, is there any one unit or theme within your study here and your body of work that you can say this group of people have done it really, really well, or this committee or these sets of policies have helped us inform how to get to that point, locally, state, or nationally, that you know of, that we can use this to learn from, right?
Yeah. I wish I did have the example to use. and I know there probably someone in education would be better than me to talk about this, but I think that we are seeing innovative patterns that are changing the trajectory for minority kids, particularly African American Hispanic kids. But I don't have all the answers to that. It's something that's important. Me and my group can only handle so many things. But you're right; those are important. And I think there is some progress. There's no doubt about it, in the sense that the absolute number of African Americans that are including college and Hispanics is increasing. There's no doubt about it.
But that is in spite of or because of?
I think a little of both. I think why I say that is that I think it's certainly programs. I think that, absolutely, there is no doubt that programs that came forward to eliminate discrimination in education have played a role in the increase in educational attainment for Hispanics and African Americans. There is no doubt about that. And so I don't think there's any, as I said, any question that those items have been important. What I was reacting to, I don't know quite how to, and I'm probably just not the right person to tell you how much of what has changed the trajectory. But clearly, for both African Americans and for Hispanics, there's been improvement in their educational attainment. There's been improvement in their competitiveness versus 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
Thank you. Dr. Murdock, a simple question. In your last few slides, you talked about closure.
Yeah.
Does that mean educational attainment?
That was talking about educational attainment. What would happen if we assume that the educational or the income differences go along with the educational differences, and we increased the more educational equity we had, assuming that, we would find increases in income for all groups.
But your final column showed if closure rates attain that of whites or non-Hispanic whites currently. So that would mean if across the board every racial category was graduating high school, college, bachelor degree.
What we didn't do, yes, that is true for everybody except Asians who already were above the average. So we didn't knock them down. We let their numbers be as they were, and then we altered the others as was appropriate to have them have greater levels of attainment.
So, Texas is still involved with redistricting lawsuit, and looking at your numbers, data I've seen says that Texas probably gained 3 or 4 more redistricting or congressional seats. Do you see that to be the same, or do you have something different with your information?
We haven't looked at that in great detail, but certainly we're the fastest growing state. Now, we haven't looked at it to say tried to figure out whether that means 1, 2, or 3, or 4. But if what is getting us there, frankly, is the diversity of our population. And so if we were to look at our growth based only on for example, non-Hispanic white population, we would not be much different than other populations. It's the diversity that is leading to that increase. Down here. Oh. I need the mic. Thank you.
First of all, Dr. Murdock, thank you very much for coming here today. Because these are important numbers. And I know you're being careful not to say that you're an education expert, but if we look at the number of Latinos and we look at how, in African Americans as well, how we fund our education system does make a difference to whether or not those individuals go to college. And so the better the education, we usually folks move forward. I think that's correct.
Yeah.
And so that's the challenge with some of this is if the majority of the people in Texas don't get a high school diploma, they are, but don't get a college degree, that changes the product that Texas produces, correct?
Yeah. Well, the thing that I normally say, and I may have already said it today, education is the single best predictor of socioeconomic progress. Has been for as long as we've been looking at this in the last 30 or 40 years when we got the statistical kind of capabilities to do that. The last 50 years, I guess. But no, education is a key. And I'm hesitant to say that because somebody says, well, what would you expect a college professor to say? That education is not important? Education is important, and it is, it's been, for analysis for years and years, it's been the single most important factor.
So just so you know, what my father always said to me is just what you said. Education is the great equalizer because education moves someone to a better income attainment. And the numbers are still wide between non-Hispanic whites, Hispanics, African Americans, except for Asians. Yeah. Because per capita they focus on college education. So something I don't know, and it don't take a risk on this if you shouldn't. But when we look at what's happening in rural areas, or we look at what's happening in blue collar areas where a lot of the population are Anglo individuals, is that having an effect on the level of attainment or what kind of jobs there are in those areas?
I'm not sure I can answer that just because I haven't looked at it that way. But I think that we're seeing, I do think that I've concentrated primarily in my work on socioeconomic differences, whether they're by race or by other.
So let's just say socioeconomic differences in rural areas that tend to be dominant in
a lot of these areas. What it amounts to is an older population,
right?
That simply didn't have the opportunity or be able to use the opportunity to get increased levels of education. So, I come from a little town in North Dakota, okay, and towns really get small in North Dakota, okay, but it's done well. Because it is one of two towns that provides a workforce for the company that manufactures these little front-end loaders that now I think Clark has, the little Bobcats they're called. What I see there is people who, if it had not been for that one factory, would be in really serious shape because there aren't any other industries there to help them.
And that applies to places in Texas as well.
Absolutely.
So that's why everyone's trying to get
rural places are struggling in many cases, not because their people aren't as good as any other place, but because the opportunities are less.
Let's see, I thought I had one more question, but anyway.
This guy's been asking, trying. No, I'll talk to anybody else afterwards.
Thank you for being here again. It's I miss county affairs so much I had to come back for one more meeting. The first time I heard about your presentation was from my sister, and I didn't. It wasn't a couple more years until I finally was able to see it at the North Texas Commission, and I told folks it was one of the best presentations, not only for the content of what you were describing and bringing to us, but also to people watch, because folks were either had their mouth open or they were on their phones as if they didn't care. And it's unfortunate that I believe that this information goes by the wayside and we're taking too long to act on it. A couple of questions I have for you. In my district, I have lots of Hispanics, but yet they've come to this country without a high school diploma. So has that ever been extracted out so that the numbers in the Hispanic population don't look worse than they really are? Because they may make our education system seem as though Hispanics aren't receiving just. And then the other question that I have for you is, give us a timeline, if you can, on where you started to relay to us the information on migration. Were those numbers always based upon current migration levels and then, a change in migration? And have you ever gone back to, let's say, post-Reagan, post-amnesty, and looked at the undocumented population and how it's grown our country? And what would happen if we would have had, let's say, current levels of immigration enforcement? And what would our population numbers look like if we would have stopped illegal or undocumented migration at a particular time frame? What would our population look like?
We have not looked at that, and we probably should. Clearly, we would have parts of the country that would have grown less, and including Texas. A Hispanic colleague of mine says you have to understand that one or more of and he argued as many as 2 of the recent representatives added to our numbers of U.S. reps was due to Hispanic immigration, domestic as well as international. It plays an important role. There's no doubt about it, and it's played an important role for Texas and for California. You take the states, the big states, and the states that have added lots of U.S. reps. I'm talking about. It's played an important role. California would not be. You can argue, because California is not only diverse with lots of African Americans and lots of Hispanics, but they've got a plethora of groups that have significant numbers, and that diversity has driven its growth more than in other words, if you took every state and said, we're only going to, it's only going to increase in terms of representation and everything else on the basis of what happened with non-Hispanic whites, you'd have a whole different pattern, and you would not, you would not see the kind of growth. The growth that you're seeing, the fastest growing states are also among the most diverse states. Diversity is important for growth.
And then the reason why I ask if you could go back and start to study that is because of the aging non-Hispanic white population and the youth of the immigrant population, what that would have on the GDP of whether it be the state or the nation. Yeah. Because I think that's the information that us as policymakers really would value and be able to work with.
Yeah, and we've done a little bit of that in the last book, but not as much as we've looked at that actually more since I'm plugging our books. I'll plug the other one too, because the interesting thing is it's not the same extent, but you know what? It's national as well. It's not just a Texas phenomena. It's a national phenomena, and the U.S., depending on what it does with its minority populations, can be more or less competitive. If we don't do a better job, we will lose competitiveness. But because our population is increasingly diverse, if we don't continue to do better with that diverse population, we could end up being less competitive in the future than we are today. We're going to be more competitive if we ensure that all Texans have the skills and education they need to be competitive. And increasing that, every analysis we've done, looking just at the data, not assuming anything else, shows that our growth for growth's sake won't necessarily make you a more prosperous state, but growth with improved education and the income differences that come with that will. There was some other lady back there.
So you've mentioned a couple of times how education is the equalizer, and so I'm just wondering if this information has been shared with colleges and universities as they prepare the future teachers.
Yes, in the sense that I've cut back now, I only do about 50 groups a year, but I would say that 35 of them are educational institutions. So they're getting the information. I haven't kept track of what each one is doing or not doing with it, but yeah. One gentleman right here, or one? Okay, then I'll come back to you.
Sorry, I know I'm double dipping, but do you have any statistics on the difference in income by gender for similar education attainment?
I don't have it readily, but I know where to get it. So, and sorry. No, but there are differences, yes. Now, some of that is what kind of job you have, okay? You know, I'll use one terrible example, but my wife got her master's degree in chemistry at LSU, and she said to her advisor, "I want to get a PhD in chemistry." He said, "Well, women don't get PhDs in chemistry." And so she went off to get her PhD in something else. It's not quite that bad now. It's not that bad now. But there are gender differences, yes. Yes, this gentleman here, I'm sorry.
I was curious, what is the impact of the cost of higher education on the different groups and their ability to move up or down the scale?
Well, I think you know, I haven't looked at this in detail. I've been a college professor my whole career, and I do think that the increased costs in higher education are a problem in terms of if we want to achieve our goals as a state, if we want to be, I don't know, who we want to be competitive with, you know, California, New York, whatever we want to do. I think that the educational attainment part of it is a big part, and I do worry. And you're going to say, well, here's a guy at a private university. What, you know, well, I shouldn't be able to say this, so to speak. But my whole background before that was being in public institutions. I'm convinced we've got to do something about the increase in costs of higher education, or we're going to exclude an increasing number of kids. But that's a personal bias.
Dr. Murdock, can you speak to, most of the focus here has been on population growth and the impact as it relates to economics and so forth. Can you speak to the quality of life when someone is well educated and the types of economic development ventures that have been very successful, you know, the Richard Floridas and so forth, that attract a different type of living and thought process to different regions?
Well, I don't think I have any special knowledge on that. I haven't done any particular analysis of that. In a general sense, I think probably from your same places as you have, it's clear that education pays for everybody, males, females, all different racial and ethnic groups. It is so that, I mean, there's no doubt but education pays. But I don't think I'm an expert on all the other factors, but clearly, I mean, the data clearly show that education pays. It pays for everybody. Now, that does not mean that racial and ethnic groups at the same levels of education and males and females at the same levels of education have the same output, the same result. But it's important for everybody.
Yeah, I think my question was really around how do we sustain a democracy if we do not invest in this, right? Because where it will pay and equal 1-to-1 is in the ballot boxes, right? That's, the economics hasn't produced. So your proposition here and projections, you know, how will they play themselves out, not just from an economic, but also from sustaining a democracy that all of us have benefited from?
You can tell I'm a technology type. Okay. I just don't I mean, that's just not enough of my area of expertise. I'm sorry. I think you're right, but I don't necessarily have the data that go with it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murdock.